As well, it was an honor. I do want to say too, I realize many people in this room could give this talk, and so I appreciate the opportunity to just give my perspective. It was a little daunting to think, oh, how do I pull the parts out of Ignatian Spirituality? I spent a lot of time thinking about the overlap of eco-spirituality, Ignatian Spirituality, but came up with some things that I hope are helpful and will help with a little reflection. Let's see, clicker is not working, but that's okay. Here's me holding the head of the snake with some help of my friends. When I was a kid, I, like a lot of kids, just liked nature, liked being outdoors. Some of my first memories are what we called creeking, where we'd go down to the creek, we'd flip rocks, we'd catch things. So that was just like an innate love that I had. I've seen it all over the world in children and other people. So that was an early love. And when it was time for college, I went to Miami University in Ohio. And people say, like, do what you love, it won't feel like work. So I got into research. I plugged into a lab that was actually doing snake research, and that was fun. And then I got to start asking my own questions in research. So kind of the early scientific worldview building here for me. This time I got to ask questions about what happens when like amphibians that have those soft jelly-like eggs get exposed to things like pesticides, and what happens when they have that stress along with other stresses like algae that humans spread, things like that. So I kind of developed inquiry. Brendan could tell you more about that, but this kind of scientific inquiry mindset. And that segued me into this graduate PhD program where I was then looking at the impacts of golf courses on stream ecosystems. It was down near the Smoky Mountain National Park. Has anybody been there before? It happens to be the salamander capital of the world, so I got to sling salamanders for a living. So it was great. I'd say as I was getting into science, a parallel but maybe uncrossing like trend in my life, I could look at the sacramental origins. That's me and my twin sister, First Communion there. I went to a Jesuit high school, and that's where I first was exposed to things a lot of us have been exposed to, like that grad. Do we have anybody from St. X? I know we have XU. Okay. Very different, yes. And I kind of, I had some great experiences like the Kairos experience and stuff, but it kind of went dormant for a while. But when I went to graduate school, I was at Mizzou, so I see you Central Southern Province. There's a Newman Center there, but it's actually run by Dominicans. And that was like a really important time in my life where I kind of matured my faith as an adult, kind of asked some tough questions, but brought it back into being important to me. That came at the same time as like my prayer life, spirituality, reading people who are really influential like Thomas Merton, Anthony DeMello, Richard Rohr. And so I had this kind of spiritual development that later led to my vocation to the Jesuits of discerning that. But even at a pretty young age, and I was in my early 20s at Mizzou teaching environmental science at this little liberal arts college, and I was teaching biology at Mizzou, and I was realizing I didn't have words for it at the time, but I was like, I'm not able to kind of talk about the true depth of our ecological. I could talk about the symptoms of our ecological crisis, but it seemed to me that there was actually deeper aspects of humans and humanity's conduct that wasn't quite being addressed, and I couldn't really teach in the public university or didn't have words for it. Later on, I saw this quote from a National Science Foundation scientist that I thought captured pretty well what I had felt. Some of you have seen me talk before, have seen this, but Gus Spieth said, "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that." And so it's kind of a true privilege. I couldn't have anticipated being in a room full of people that are poised to have cultural and spiritual transformation. That's what a lot of us do for a living. But it's not always exactly within the realm of data collection. And of course, I teach that EMVS 101 class that Nancy pointed out. It's important to learn about these topics of biodiversity loss and climate change, but it ends up just more and more data isn't leading to the change of heart, so the changes of action that we need. Thankfully, we had Laudato Si come on the scene. This actually came out the same year that I became a Jesuit in 2015. And it really pressed right into what I think was missing and helped to articulate what maybe a lot of people like myself kind of felt but couldn't quite put words to, and that was beautiful and rich. So one thing I love for you to kind of question along with me these days that I've been thinking a lot about is what was unique about Laudato Si? Like, what caused it to strike such a chord? What caused it to continue to inspire conferences and talks and weeks on campuses and high schools and parishes? because I think when we think about integral ecology, the message that it had, it's very similar to things that have been around for a long time, like environmental science, right? Environmental science already does say that there are environmental problems and social problems. So that wasn't necessarily totally unique. How does it differ from sustainability, which also has a very kind of social science human component? I think there is something that's different, but I think that's what we need to press into. That's going to be what we can uniquely contribute and grow within the context of the people gathered in this room. So I think that's an ongoing question that the Society of Jesus is still doing, is what is integral ecology exactly, and what is it that's attractive and different? When I look at the Laudato Si Action platform, which Mike Shook here has been really influential in organizing this at the university level, and it's at the other 6 kind of sector or community sectors as well, I would argue what's different from this list than the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals, for example, because there's a lot of overlap in just kind of reducing our carbon footprint from our lifestyles and ecological education and community engagement. I would say the unique one here is ecological spirituality, right? I mean, it's not the only unique thing, but it's one that doesn't necessarily come up in a lot of other more secularized contexts. I happen to teach a course in eco-spirituality. It's been a true privilege. When I came back to Loyola, I got to develop this course, and I've taught it for 4 years now. It's been a little different each time. Colin Price helped me teach it one time. Way to go, Colin. Hasn't been the same without you, though. And I hesitate to define eco-spirituality just because, I mean, I don't know. I don't like to pin something down, and a lot of students end up having different ideas, but we find the commonality. But some aspects of eco-spirituality that are consistent is it's looking at things, the interconnectedness of everything, right? Pope Francis really got that in Laudato Si. The study of ecology is the study, I mean, as John Muir said poetically, if you pluck at a single thing in nature, you find it connected to the rest of the world. It's both poetic and empirically true as well. We can measure and put data to how things interact and are interconnected. So there's kind of this spatial connectivity. There's also a temporal connectivity, and that's cosmology. It brings this idea that you can't look at anything without its geological context, its evolutionary context. When you start doing that, we're talking millions of years, billions of years. Hard for us to fathom, but it's part of the reality in which God created. Doing this in a way that encourages awe and wonder is another aspect of eco-spirituality. Encouraging that, not just kind of saying, hey, we need to stay empirical and objective, but allowing people to kind of be amazed in the way that kids are when they go creaking, right? Enhancing a spiritual worldview with scientific information. So I think faith community people have a lot to learn about understanding about cosmology and ecology, so that's something that will enhance our understanding of the world and how good of global citizens we are. And then similarly, I think the scientific community can be enhanced, enriched by adding the interiority of spirituality too. So those are some of the aspects when we talk about what is eco-spirituality. And hard to define, but I'll read this paragraph quickly from a student who had an anonymous kind of reflection after learning a little bit about eco-spirituality from class. They said, even though the environmental challenges like climate change, deforestation, and pollution are very real, this eco-spirituality class has helped me come to a sense of peace with these problems. This is not because I'm in denial of them, but because I now understand the role that spirituality can play in helping sustain our hope of a better, more just future. Eco-spirituality doesn't promise quick fixes, but it does offer a way to live meaningfully, and that alone is very powerful. As surprised as I am to say this class will have a lasting impact on me. No offense. Don't know how to take that, but not just intellectually, but also on how I am going to try and live moving forward. I've already begun to use some of our insights in my daily life. For example, I now treat my time in nature as a spiritual practice. I pay attention more when I walk outside. I try to listen to the sounds of the world around me. This simple action has already helped deepen my connection to the earth and has made me more mindful of my role here. So I thought that was a nice little glimpse of, in one person's life, what eco-spirituality, and what I think we would say also ecological conversion looks like. Maybe eco-spirituality is kind of a vehicle for ecological conversion. So the Society of Jesus, about 6 years ago, a lot of you were involved in this, decided to say, well, what unique kind of works are we going to do moving forward? We do a lot of different things, but what will we kind of make preference or prioritize in the next 10 years? We discern the 4 UAPs. All of us are here for the 4th UAP. I increasingly find a lot of connection with the 3rd one. How do we talk about caring for a common home while also keeping and providing hope for young people? But we've also been told, I think repeatedly, I know us younger Jesuits have, that the other ones won't make sense if they're not first through the first one, if they're not rooted in showing the way to God, especially in a uniquely Ignatian way, through the spiritual exercises, through discernment. We could easily just focus on those others and start to lose that kind of integral identity. So that's one of the questions is, as we move into these next couple days, how can we make sure we stay tethered, rooted to that aspect that kind of defines us from other organizations that are thinking about how we accompany young people, care for our common home, walk with the excluded. I was thinking, one thing, if you've ever done spiritual direction in the Ignatian sense or started a retreat, day one is often about just context setting, getting the context. So a couple things we could think about as we set the context for this assembly. One thing that's I would say is the bedrock of my vocation. Few things can explain it well, how did this happen? But one of them is gratitude. Actually, building on a bedrock of gratitude, as Ignatius said, is always a sound virtue. So I ask you to just turn to somebody briefly and just share what's something you're grateful for right now. As you enter into this assembly, what's something in your own personal life that you're bringing in gratitude? So go ahead and turn to somebody, share that gratitude. Okay, so along with gratitude and thinking about places that have been part of your story, like the picture that you slapped into one of our provinces and or Maryland, just think about people who have been part of your life, maybe mentors that have been kind of gotten you into nature or sustainability, or maybe the Jesuit network. So just remembering those people who are part of our story, part of our ending up here, part of who have influenced us that we carry with us. Think about your individual works that you're representing in the different provinces. I think it's just really fun to think about. I'm part of a generation who can easily forget about history, kind of be untethered by history, but to remember, we're part of a lineage and a line. We can trace back our particularly institutions. So think of your place, maybe a coworker with you there, maybe somebody you help to serve if that's the case, just picturing that particular place that's important to you as part of this work. Now think about how you could go back in time if you know the history of your place, when it was founded, maybe who founded it. A lot of times it was international Jesuits that were coming from abroad. But all of us can trace our Jesuit lineage back to Spain, right? Back to the Basque country. I'm going to make this story brief, but I had a moment. Anybody gotten to travel to the Ignatian pilgrimage to Spain to see some of the sites? Really incredible, right? Any pilgrimage adds in a new dimension. This was real. There's Ignatius' shoes. And I had a moment where I was feeling, I was tired from the travel over, discombobulated, different time zone. I also was feeling frustrated that my Spanish was so bad. It had gotten rusty. That was my fault. I didn't. My Basque is horrible, believe it or not. But I was walking down to, there's a stream, maybe a small river that goes right through Loyola, and Ignatius definitely would have played me. He would have gone creaking in this place. And I kind of sat down next to it, and I was kind of in a bad mood, so I was thinking, I couldn't even tell you what species are in this stream. And I was noticing some little snails and some little isopods. And then I noticed the algae on the rocks, and I noticed some dragonflies zipping around. And I just had this moment I wasn't expecting to have, and I realized, I know this place. I have my own river that's stacked up over there, and I have my own understanding. And I had this sense of God kind of telling me, I work here just like I do there, just like I do over there. And I had this sense too, because I had this building idea that Ignatius was so special, and why don't we have more Ignatiuses? Why, God, aren't you lifting people up like that? And I had this sense of God telling me, I worked in Ignatius just like I work in you. I do it through human desires. I do it through your yes. And it might not look the same way, but don't expect it to. And it was just a super consoling moment through this little ecosystem in a stream that I was not expecting. But it helped. The moment transcended both the time across the globe and also the time back to Ignatius. And one of the things that can kind of confuse me or frustrate me, maybe you felt this, maybe not, but it's easy sometimes to separate ourselves a little bit from what Ignatius was about. Maybe Ignatian values get cited. It can feel pretty distant from anything to do with God or Jesus. And one thing that I think, if you've gone on that pilgrimage, you know, Ignatius' life doesn't make much sense when you extract him from his relationship with God. That was the driver of every decision he made, what he did, whether it was crazy seeming or whether it was logistical. Ignatius only makes sense in his relationship to God. He had a very Trinitarian view, but when we extract them from that, it confuses our students, it can confuse us, and it's just a reminder to being rooted in that as part of our lineage, our legacy. If we're going to say we're following in the tradition of Ignatius, it only makes sense to see how much his eyes were constantly locked into God. He was constantly in prayer, and quite frankly, he was crying a lot through like spiritual movement. And yet, at the same time, the story of creation doesn't start with Jesus of Nazareth, right? That's another bizarre thing that can kind of be confusing for Christians. So rooting ourselves in a cosmic context can be really powerful, I think. And if you study biology or geology or evolution, you have to think in terms of geological scale, right? So here's a little activity I did with some young Jesuits in an integral ecology course. It's a way of scaling, thinking about the timeline of the Earth. Let's see if this is going. Okay, so let's say we want to represent each generation. We're going to kind of visualize a timeline. Each step could represent 25 years, which is about one human generation. And so if you go back 400 steps, it takes you back the equivalent of 10,000 years, which is around the time where agriculture was first kind of appearing in different places. So it's a way of visualizing just how long 10,000 years is, right? So if you do this, about 8 steps from your starting point gets you to the Industrial Revolution, not that long ago, just about 200 years. 20 steps in that scale would get you to the point where St. Ignatius was born in the 1500s. About 80 steps would get to the point when Jesus was born 2,000 years ago. We still have 320 steps that you could be walking, and I put it on the map here that this would be 400 steps would be about from the IC where we are right here, if you were on the ground level, back to SES. So it's a lot of steps, and thinking about each little human generation and me just being one of those steps, it's kind of a way to root us back and say, oh yeah, this is an old Earth with an old story, right? And then just to take it to the next level, if you take those 400 steps and in your mind you condense it down, let's say we want to make a comparison to then how long would it be to go back to when terrestrial plants first appeared? That's a pretty important time in Earth's life when plants showed up about 400 million years ago. Well, you'd have to condense our 400 steps and calibrate it to 1 inch, okay? So you got that 1 inch, which represents that whole timeline you just walked. And it would take over a half mile, 0.63 miles of you walking and just imagining 1 inch is, most of human civilization as we think about it. And just how small that is. And Jesus' birth being a very recent time within that very small scale. So these are just little ways that catch these little sideways glimpses of oh wow, I'm so wrong in my normal way of operating about what's the most important and how important I am and the timeline of things. And so for some people this is alarming, and it also sounds like it could be downplaying Jesus' birth, and it's no, it's just putting Jesus' birth into the biological context in which God decided to create. I think that's an important part of contextualizing what we're about when we dare to say we want to stick up for the earth and help protect ecosystems that have taken millions of years to generate or become as they are today. I'll put this will show up in a reference Google Drive. Brenna, I think, where are you, Brenna? There you are, yeah. So it'll be in a Google Drive. And I had a student in that Eco-Spirituality class a couple years ago make a cosmic timeline. It happens to be here to Loyola University, so we're at that little star. So if you start down at the starting point, which is the School of Environmental Sustainability, you can kind of walk this timeline. They did it to the whole 13.8 billion years, not the first plant life, and you calibrated it to the number of steps. So if you find yourself with a little downtime, you want to contemplate the size of existence, then go for it. One of the voices that was pretty influential in eco-spirituality is Thomas Berry. I'm sure a number of you have heard of him, maybe others he's new. But he wrote an influential book and an essay called A New Story. And he said, it's all a question of story. We're in trouble just now because we do not have a good story. We're in between stories. The old story, the account of how the world came to be and how we fit into it, is not functioning properly. And we have not learned the new story. The old story has sustained us for a long period of time. It shaped our emotional attitudes, provided us with a life purpose, energized action, it consecrated suffering, integrated knowledge, guided education. We woke up in the morning and we knew where we were. And you could continue to read deep insights that he has. But I see this a lot with young people, maybe you do too, of just not really being tethered into a sense of who they are, where they are, what they're about. That's kind of been lost for a lot of people. Now, we Christians and we working with the Jesuits have these convenient and very important stories that we can be tethered to, like back to Basque Country, back to Jesus' life. Think about Easter Vigil Mass. We kind of root ourselves in this salvation history, and it's important, but it doesn't always have a place for when we start to think about terrestrial plants 400 million years ago, or geological formations. And it's time to integrate that into our understanding of ourselves, what we're about, the work we're being asked to do. Okay, it's going to be an abrupt change, but you all need to talk with each other again. Okay, so this sign was spotted in one of our retreat houses. It was part of a series of little placard things, but go ahead and take a peek at it, and I am going to cut you off. You'll be talking full force. You'll be annoyed that I'm going to cut you off, but it's going to happen. I'll say it ahead of time. But I want you to discuss with your partner this sign that says, "The earth has cancer, and the cancer is man." Do you agree with that? Do you disagree? Have you felt this before? Go ahead and chat really quick with a partner about this. Okay, so thinking about humans, what does it mean to be a human? I don't know about you, but I've talked to a lot of students. It's usually not explicitly said, but you can just under the surface, there's this assumption that our existence is just problematic, right? Yep. Especially our sustainability students. Like, you're learning all day about this destruction that humans are having. It's not that crazy to think this is problematic to be a human. I'm ashamed to be it. There's reasons for that. But I want to say, think about what that means to one's mental health and sense of self if it comes down to, that's what I'm a part of, and that's my story, is kind of being this cancer on the planet. So, encounter it a lot. Maybe you have. Maybe you felt it like I do too. Let's compare that to asking in an Ignatian context, who are humans? What does it mean to be a human? We have the principle and foundation. There's a bunch of different versions of the principle and foundation. I'm sure you've seen them. I pulled one, the Bergen and Schwann one, which talks about, I am from love, of love, and for love. Let my heart, O God, always recognize, cherish, and enjoy your goodness. Direct me towards your praise, your reverence. Different terminology, different sense of what we're created for and why we're on this planet than simply to minimize our ever-increasing exhaustion of our natural resources, right? So I think keep this in mind, that this is something that maybe I take for granted because I was, I'm a Jesuit, I've been raised in a Christian tradition. Lots of Christians don't necessarily get this message either, but we have this message, and hopefully we feel it and we live it, and that is a gift to share to people who are trying to do this good work towards minimizing negative impact on the planet. Here's one that comes from a version of the exercises called the New Exercises. I don't love the name, but I like the concept, and it is, what if Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was kind of in conversation with St. Ignatius, and how would we write the exercises? And so he says, we're created to make a unique contribution to the great evolutionary project, the God project, as he says. We're continually supported by God, bringing all creation together into one magnificent, conscious, loving union. Since all the other things in the universe are created to share with us this common eternal destiny, they are essential to and inseparable from you as we participate in this ongoing journey. So there's this word. I'm not going to read it all, but just to say, think of the difference of having like a purpose, what we would say like a vocation, an environmental vocation. It's not just like a job that's tacked on. It's like part of what God is doing in the world, and we are God's hands and feet as we move forward to right these wrongs, to work towards mutually beneficial living on this planet. So we have language and we have understanding of ourselves and what we're about that the world needs to hear right now. They're doing great work. A lot of our people are doing great work, but it's hard to be sustained, get out of bed in the morning when your identity is just problematic and the problems are too big. I'll just say, does anybody remember this response? I'm a sinner, but I trust in the infinite mercy and patience of our Lord Jesus Christ. This was an answer to the question, who is Jorge Bergoglio? This first kind of interview. He's having this, because I think a lot of you might say, well, there's a lot of problems in the world, Mark. Like, it's not just love, coming from love for love, that's great. There's a lot of problems in the world, and that's true. And that's where we talk about sin and have the language of sin. I didn't want to focus on that. Maybe we can just assume that there's a lot of environmental destruction and problems. Pope Francis would say that comes from our sinful nature, and yet that's not our definition. We're loved sinners. We're held by the loving grace and mercy of God. So, and I think just another thing to keep in mind these next couple days, when we attempt to understand who our Creator is, we're also learning who our deepest selves are too. So it goes hand in hand with the discovery of ourselves. It's not just this kind of, encyclopedic knowledge. It's learning more about ourselves and what it means to be human at the same time. And then I love the way that Pope Francis ended Laudate Deum, the very last line. He said, "Praise God is the title of this letter, but when human beings claim to take the place of God, they become their own worst enemies." And so that's why it's good to kind of remember what it is we're doing, what our identity is, what our work is about. We're going to do great work this week. You all are great workers. This is a chance to worry less about, your desk work and your Google calendars, and I encourage you to infuse contemplation into your action this week together in this community. We know contemplative action being part of our tradition. The great work that we're being called to do, the people in this room are part of this broader great work that once again Thomas Berry wrote about. It's to carry out the transition from a period of human devastation of the earth to a period where humans would be present to the planet in a mutually beneficial manner. I think it might be worth just asking ourselves, do I even think that's possible? I pose this to students a lot, and sometimes there's resistance, and maybe they just, I don't know, is it even possible that we could live mutually beneficial? That's not the message I've got, and that I see in the newspapers and in the scientific journals. Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about this too. She has the same problem with students pushing back against humans only being negative in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, which talks about how sweetgrass and other grasses can thrive more in the presence of humans. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of start landing the plane here, but I think it's worth saying, think about each one of you uniquely, right? We have the language of the body of Christ, different parts, one body. We have the language of ecosystems, different niches, different trophic levels, one ecosystem. Think about you particularly, how you fit into this. We're not called to be uniform in our response, thank God. We're going to each bring our different gifts. I think these days will be a great time to shed more light on that. It could be not only our individual works, the gifts of the society and the gifts of our individual ministries. This is what we're about this week. Here's one that I think is really important, kind of ending with this idea of the primacy of grace, being Easter people. It's a constant message that we constantly struggle with, but Thomas Berry says in his book, can we actually believe that the same energies and spirits, let's say, the same divine manifestations that are part of this 13.8 billion year unlikely existence that made this happen, can we believe that that's still inspiring and guiding us and moving us forward? That's maybe a more secularized way to say it. We would say, can we believe that the Spirit, that God wouldn't just set us up for failure and disappointment and that there wouldn't be any way forward? It's part of the Christian message and it's part of being a believer. It's not an easy answer, but faith isn't easy, but we can ask ourselves, what can we do in this time to keep building up that faith that's going to sustain the action that we're doing that helps us reduce carbon footprints and teach about the environment? This is the last paragraph of Laudato Si, kind of reiterating, God who calls us to this commitment, calls us into this room, has inspired us to be here through people and through our yeses, won't just kind of leave us. In the heart of this world, the Lord of life who loves us so much is always present, like the contemplatio. He does not abandon us. He does not leave us alone. He's united us to himself. Praise be to him. So having that trust, of course it means we still need to do work and there's urgency, but it's not from our own work and white knuckling. And then finally, in this concept of being Easter people, always being called to think about our problems, our issues in the context of the resurrection. It's what we're called to do. I'd add Pentecost into that as well. I've been thinking a lot about us and being on the 4th floor of the IC, which is a great space here. I think of like the upper room a little bit, like a bunch of people who are stressed and like unsure, and the signs of the times are horrible, and we're all here gathered, probably a little bit afraid. And I don't know about you, I haven't been moved in this way in a while, but the first words of Pope Leo when he came out on the balcony, I was with a couple of you during that, and he just said, "Peace be with all of you." I don't usually think of popes as like, God speaking through the popes, but it was like the first time where I was like, yeah, this is what we need to hear. The world isn't a spot where we're huddled in the upper room. We need to hear, peace be with all of you. I'm with you. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you for your time and attention. And I think next might be some talking amongst ourselves. So thank you, everybody.